when Yolanda and I just came together, and her sense was that we'd been working together for a long time. Did I catch that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I was going to share is, so just in that, you see the power of connection. So a month ago, the three of us, I don't think we'd even met before. And Yolanda and Judith knew each other. I was new to both of them. And so when I just had this belief that when things are meant to be and when they're meant to happen, that there's something bigger than me that guides a lot of what I do. And so being guided into this relationship with Judith and with Yolanda may seem like we have been together for a long time. And really, I will just say more, it's about the connections that we made just in the little bit of time that we've chatted with each other. And I bring that in because I really truly believe that absent relationships, everything that we're talking about is impossible. You can't transform hate into love if you don't have a relationship. You can't create belonging and inclusion without relationships. And I think so much of the work that we've done in our personal lives, and I think, and I'll speak for me in my personal life and in my professional life, has been programmatically driven. In other words, I'll go to the right workshop, I'll come to the correct conference, or I'll read the right book, or if I'm in a business, I'll bring in the right facilitator, and that will make everything go smooth. And what I would submit to all of us is that if that were the case, we'd have been done with this a long time ago, and we wouldn't be having to still have these conversations in 2021. So what I ask you to think about is that if it's not about programs, then it's about people. So how do we invest more in each other? How do we invest more in the relationships that you currently have to take people's thinking into different places? Because that's all we have the power to do. And I spend about as much time with people who have no desire to do this work or think it'll never result in anything as I do with people who are really grounded in it and believe it can change the world. And what I can say for the most part, and I say for the most part because I'm just a human being who makes mistakes, is I do my best to treat everybody the same in that I want to make a connection with them. Because I've found that the people who I thought or heard or had labeled as so diametrically different than me, when I start to make connections, and when I'm talking about connections, I'm talking about the music that I listen to, the activities that I like to do, hearing stories about somebody else's family and then thinking about my own family. So I'm talking about real connections about who we are, not superficial connections about what we do or how much money we make, things like that. And so if you just take one thing away from listening to me, I would encourage you to realize that absent relationships, none of this is possible. We will never turn hate into love without connecting with the people that we believe we hate. And I think that's the most challenging piece, is that we're talking about confronting is just the first step. That just means to me, I'm going to look at you and say, one or both of us is a hateful person. And personally, when I attract people that I label as hateful or mean, then it's an indicator to me that there must be some residuals of that within me, or I wouldn't even have attracted them into my life. So that's one piece. And then the next piece is then thinking about how can I get past how I've labeled them to connect with who they are. That's authenticity. And so that's when we move from confronting to transforming. And I will tell you, my own philosophy is that self-awareness without action is a waste of time. I should just remain unconscious if I'm going to do nothing with what I bring into my thinking. So that's the other piece, is what's the action you're going to take after this? Well, this may seem like work and this is going to be impactful. All I'm really doing is presenting, and all I'm really doing is being a part of this moment. And then I have to think about, now what do I do next? How do I take this and really manifest some change, even if it's in myself, some new awareness, or another person, another concept I'll bring into our thinking in this session, and then I'll turn it back to my colleagues, is that it's all driven, oh geez, I just lost my train of thought, sorry. That happens sometimes.
Yep.
I'm gonna let Judith jump in and then I'll try to bring it back. So I'm not gonna just sit here and think in front of you. So Judith or Yolanda, jump in, and when I
Thanks,
think
Bill.
about it, I'll wave.
Happens to me all the time. Yolanda, did you want to jump in? Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, yes. I know that when we gain knowledge about something that we can improve, right, in this training, right, there's a lot of knowledge that you're taking with you. And a lot of the times that could create a sense of urgency. Like, I want to know what I can do so I don't create more harm with the biased, thinking and behaviors, right, that I am putting out in the world. And I feel like a reminder that just Bill mentioned, it's about action, but it's also about patience. And it's about, for me, it's about admitting that I am going to not get it right a lot of the times. A lot of the times there's going to be a lot of things that I'm going to be doing unintentionally, my bias. And then what I do with that information is what really matters, right? It's not so much about creating this sense of perfection, or that I'm going to get, now that I know this information, I'm going to get it right and I'm going to create an action. A lot of the time that path is really muddy and messy because sometimes our actions, even when we think that we're doing in a way that is creating less harm because of our bias, we're not going to get it right, right? So I think what I'm inviting folks to think about is how do we also not feed into that sense of trying to be perfect in this journey, right? That we're going to hurt people, that we're going to harm people, and that's just something that I have embraced in my life. And the question then comes up to, what do I do with that information? And for us to start thinking about that, and how am I kind to myself, right, in this process? How do I show compassion to myself? How do I show kindness to myself in this process of correcting and making things, less harmful for people?
And I'd like to introduce a tool that people can use. And I'm going to put it in the chat too. It's the implicit association test. This is a project that Harvard has been doing for years now. Millions of people have taken it. Social scientists figured out a way to try to measure your implicit and subconscious thinking. And you can go on, it's free. You can do little 5-minute tests on your bias, men, women, on different racial categories, on fit and fat, on foreign born and born in the country, all kinds of different things that you can look at. I haven't been there for a little while, so I'm guessing that there's probably even some more of those that can be done. But one of the things to understand about our implicit bias is it not only can work out as stereotypes and a sense of superiority and inferiority about others, it really also has to do with our own sense. So when I took the test, I was really surprised sometimes to see where I would have a bias against my own identity. So, for the male, female, I had a bias toward men in a good way. Like, I had an unconscious negative bias toward women. I'm a woman. That didn't make sense, except that our unconscious bias is largely shaped by the culture we're in. And so the messages we get, and the problem with the way in which we've organized our society, the problem with racism, anti-Semitism, all of those things, is that it's based on an idea of superiority and inferiority. So working on your own sense of inferiority can be very empowering. And understanding that in our implicit bias, in the piece we don't see, we are carrying some of that forward. And also want to point out that the other thing that implicit bias can play into is what happens societally to others. Tests were done at studies were done at PSU that showed that cars stop for Black pedestrians like something like 5 times less often than they did for white pedestrians. So I don't believe that people were driving through and saying, oh, there's a Black person wanting to cross the street, I'm not going to let him. I think that that's an implicit bias. And I think we don't see people. And that comes from the ways that we have been socialized towards each other. And because we're a very segregated country in the main, you know, a lot of people did not grow up around people who weren't like them, that we have ended up not having a really good firsthand experience. And as Bill says, it's about the relationships. And our biases, our implicit bias can actually keep us from being open to relationships that will be very valuable to us and give us our own real life experience of each other.
So I'm going to remind everybody to use the chat if you have questions or comments or just something you want to share. So I love that conversation, and now I'm taking notes so I don't forget. So because there's too many great things that I'm hearing. So one is that I want to say one of my philosophies is this work is about practice. It's not about perfection. No one will ever be perfect at this. I don't even believe there's such a thing as being culturally competent, because to me, the word competency means that I've achieved something and I'm there, and I don't believe I'll ever be there because there's just a lot that I can do and continue to grow into. So you're not shooting for perfection, you're shooting for practice. And the nice thing about the topic that we're talking about is every morning that we're fortunate enough to wake up and be around people, we get to practice. So the practice is everywhere. It just goes back to how conscious are you of the practices that you're going through every day? Because just going through life is a practice from my perspective now. So that's one piece. The other piece is I've had this conversation for years with people, especially in education, about do you teach these behaviors of empathy and inclusion and belonging, or do you model these behaviors? And I'll have a conversation with anybody. My belief, based on my own experience and working with thousands of people over the years, is that we model these to each other. I can never teach you what it means to be vulnerable. I could tell you the definition. And yet, if I don't tell you my stories, then I'm not modeling vulnerability. And so as you walk away from today, think about what are the things that you want to model based on what you've experienced. And then just pick one. And again, a daily practice is something that you do with hyper consciousness. That's the key to critical self-reflection, is hyper consciousness about a particular aspect or trait that you're not seeing the impact that you want. And so I have to think a lot about my language, because language is very powerful. And so I didn't want that to come out as you thinking that I believe everyone needs to change or you need to do this, because I really want you to just understand that this is accessible to everyone as long as we're willing to do our own work. And so really think about the language that you use, because even confronting hate is no different than when people tell me they're anti-bias. To me, that's deficit-based language. And so that's why I shifted around it. What I want is to transform and to be more loving. And so how do I use that as my step into it versus I'm trying to shift hate? And when people say anti-bias or even anti-racist, the word anti is a deficit-based word. And from a bias perspective, I can't be anti something that is a part of me. And and I think the language that people use that supports that perspective is great. So I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying from my approach, it's like, so if I wasn't being anti-racist, what would I be? Well, I'd be looking at people and recognizing their skin color, but I wouldn't be using it as a predictor for how I was going to treat them. I would see that someone is a different gender or age, and I would be curious, or I wouldn't at least make it something that I would judge or stereotype about. And that curiosity would depend on my relationship. So what I invite you all to do is to think about if you were being anti-racist or if you were being anti-hate, what would you be doing differently? And then put all of your energy into that doing differently, because that's where the power is. That's what will propel you to different levels of your own personal growth as you start to see, wow, I just had a conversation with somebody that didn't agree with me and I didn't get emotionally charged this time, because the next time you might. So it's just like, that's a learning process, I guess is how I'll say it, that has helped me, is to shift that language. Because even growing up in a home where the narrative was, you're worthless, you'll never amount to anything, you'll never be successful. Before I could change my behavior, I had to change my narrative. And I had to tell myself, even when I didn't believe it, that I could accomplish anything I wanted to. And I didn't believe it when I started. And I tell kids, especially, that, y'all are lucky today, because when I had to figure something out, I had to go to the library and use the card catalog and then go to the decimal system. And all you have to do now is Google. So really just thinking about the language that we use. And again, as I said, it doesn't only do harm when it comes out my mouth. If I hold it in my head, it's doing harm. So I'm going to stop there again.
Bill, I really appreciate that. I want to, as a white woman who has been explicit in my desire for social and racial justice, I have had such a journey. I've made a million mistakes, but I have found that doing this internal work around my bias has allowed me to stay open and curious. And I think that's really important too, because I think for a lot of white people, in my experience, I'll speak for myself, I hit these places where I get very triggered. That's what triggered me, is when you said that about being triggered. And what I have noticed is that I have a tendency, and this is where my white privilege comes in, to want to just stop there. I don't really want to go further. It's really, it's very disorienting, really, for me as a white person to completely really understand how powerful racism has been and how harmful it's been. There is a time I feel like I feel like I have felt like I lost so much of the narrative I grew up with, right? The things I was told, the way that history was portrayed to me, the things I believed about the country, the things I believed about the people that came before me. And it has been difficult because it's like walking on a very, I don't feel like I'm on solid ground. However, I really believe that where that place is an interim step toward a transformative way of seeing each other, and a transformative way of believing that we belong to each other. And so I really want to encourage folks that find themselves coming up against themselves or their white liberalism, or however we want to put it, as we go on this journey, to really notice what's going on inside. How are we feeling that in our body? And I'm going to let Yolanda talk a little more about a somatic, thinking about somatics as we do this work, and what is going on, what might be going on in terms of my own bias. And because I have been acculturated in a society that is about supremacy and superiority, what does it mean for me to relinquish that identity? As much as I can consciously say, ick, no, I don't want to feel like I'm better than anyone else. But I know that subconsciously, that has been one of the prerequisites for belonging. And in the white sort of United States male way of thinking about who we are as a people together. And so there is a feeling of being sort of left, out to float on my own. And so really thinking about, what does it mean to let that go?
Yeah. I think that for me, doing the internal work of bringing my implicit bias into awareness, into conscious, is also understanding how I am situated in systems of power. And power being defined as, having the ability to have agency for determining what your reality could look like, right? You have choices, you have choices, right? You have opportunities, you can shape your life. And I work really hard in understanding that we are born into systems that are already, they already come with certain ways of who holds power as a group. And I think that's for me personally, it's very important for us to understand what is our place in systems of power. How do we as a society are given power, and who has power just by who they are, right? Not so much of what they did, whether they're working hard enough or not, but just who they are. And I think for me, I understand where I understand my place in that power dynamics, right? I understand that I was born into a system that if I don't have a disability, at least a disability that, so I was born into a system, right? That if you don't have a disability, if you can be a male or female, you're going to be acceptance, right? There's some normalcy to that, right? I was born into a system that if you are a US citizen, right, that you have certain rights and protections. I was born into a system that really validates college education and really validates, titles, not so much lived experience, right? I was born into a system that really elevates the values that are coming from men, right? Patriarchal. We live in a patriarchal society. So for me is really understanding what are some of the systems of power that I was born into, and where do I fit into those systems of power, right? Being a Mexican indigenous, being a woman, and also living in this country. I lived in this country undocumented for many years. I knew that just for what I was bringing into, that some systems of power were not actually the power that I had, the power that I didn't have. So there was power over me, right? There was policies, the practices, the cultural norms that were saying that if you belong to those powers, that the system, that you already will come with certain acceptance and certain belongings. So I think that for me, understanding that where is my place within those power dynamics, and understanding that the cultural norms and practices and policies are sometimes set up to benefit certain groups, right? Certain powers. And I think that for me, this implicit bias is really understanding and really thinking about what power do I have, not just individually, as what power that do I see that I have myself, but what power do I have within systems? And I think that kind of helps me understand that there's going to be more tendencies for society to reinforce those biases because of the dominant group or the groups in power that are actually shaping, right, the way that we set up standards and values and practices. So I think that that's part of my internal work that I'm doing, that the Bill was talking about, that is very important for us to understand power and to understand where do we fit, how are we situated in systems of power, and to really also understand not just what dominant culture, what not dominant norms, right, are are actually there, but who is excluding, right? Who's being excluded by those dominant cultures and norms. Yeah, so just some facts about that.
I
Oh,
love.
sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Judith.
Well, I was just going to say, so, you know, Yolanda and I work at the city. We didn't introduce ourselves, I realized at the beginning, but we work at the Office of Equity and Human Rights at the city of Portland. And so our daily job is actually addressing systemic bias, systemic racism, ableism. And it is so important to recognize that this is such a complex thing. That identities that have been assigned to us, race is a social construct, but it's a really strong one. I'm really thinking about, and I think you're in here, Emmett Wheatfall, who is always inspiring and always triggers my thinking. And the poem this morning, I found myself just feeling it deep inside of me. But as we're talking, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I think that's what that's about. And it's important that we connect all of who we are. We are connected, so your safety is about my safety. And it is important to recognize, no matter what we think about ourselves, we live in a society that persists in categorizing us, that persists in oppressing people based on their identities, you know, to not be, you know, my Black brother and sisters do not feel safe. And for good reason. They feel safe driving their car. You know, it is not a safe place. And some of that comes out of the implicit bias, but some of it's explicit too. And I think until we come to a reckoning of saying, this is a system that we have perpetuated in our country, we are going to continue to be in a society where some of us are much less safe than others. And I'm saying this to tie this to our bigger theme about hate crime as well. So it's work on so many different levels. And I do believe, as Bill says, it's personal. You start with relationship, but don't wait till you have it perfectly. You know, just continue to advocate, continue to think about what it takes to create a society of belonging versus othering. Put that out wherever you can. Use your agency. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. And I just feel it's really important to say that we can continue to evolve together.
May I offer a comment?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, hi. Judith and I go back a long way, a lot of years in the equity, diversity, inclusion a movement and work. And I want to offer for a thought. I thought what Yolanda said was absolutely powerful, in the way that she articulated was absolutely excellent, in the sense that I love Isabella Wilkerson's work, her seminal work called Caste. And she emphasized one of the power structures that has been set up in our society is colorism. And it is a powerful construct, because what we've done with color is that we've actually given, for example, white is supposed to be pure, beautiful, you know, wonderful, Black, dark arts. So immediately you set up a construct that is limiting and defining. She tells the story, and I'm loosely saying it very quickly, from her book. She says she was on the African continent, and she said to a Black, I believe the person was a poet or an academic, and she said, you know, Black people here. And the person responded, there are no Black people in Africa, because they don't go by the color Black. What they do is they go by their ethnic identification or their national identification. And the final thing I want to say on this is that this idea of what I try to say to people is that, look, you're white. That's immutable. You can't, if we're going to assign white as a color to a group of people, that's immutable. You can't change that. The enormous challenge is what do you do with that whiteness? Because inherent, there's going to be a certain amount of privilege. Do you abuse that privilege, or do you recognize that privilege privilege and make sure that a privilege is not something that is used in an oppressive kind of way. Final point, and I'll stop, is that I encountered a situation a couple of weeks ago where I was in one of these dialogues, and the gentleman got upset when the subject of white supremacy came up. And Judith, I said to him, I said, why are you angry? Why would you put on the slipper? Remember the Cinderella story? If that's not you, why would you put the slipper on? And so anyway, thank you for letting me offer some commentary on that. I appreciate that very much. Good to see you, Judith.
Thank you, Emmett. Same here.
Emmett, I'm going to start with your last comment because I think that's real. And I think in some ways, some of us in this work perpetuate that, especially with white men, when we name them as the problem. Now, I've never done that because I don't believe that's right, or to say, because you're a white man, you're obviously all racist and you're all white supremacists. But I know that there are people who do that in this work. And I think that's damaging because it's not a group of people that's the problem. It's the challenge that we have connecting with each other. And I can't agree more about this, the whole tribalism piece. I've worked with folks who didn't identify, as you said, as Black because they were tribal. And it's not to say that they don't lack discrimination, because one gentleman told me, he said, well, the way we would discriminate is if your tribe's only 100 years old and my tribe's 1,000 years old, then we think we're better than you. And so it's interesting how privilege plays out in most of our now called communities versus tribes. And so I just think that's something to think about. And the whole power piece is really important, because all of these systems were created by white men to benefit white men. That's something that is real. It wasn't called the founding fathers and mothers. It was called the founding fathers. And so these systems that we're operating in, it's not that the white men are the problem. It's just that the system was just designed for a certain group of people, and that group of people has now expanded. And so rather than demonizing and denigrating each other, it's time to have a conversation about what would the system look like to meet the needs of the diversity of the people who are now a part of it. And it's so much more than race. And the idea of belonging is that I can be a part of this culture, this community, this work group, without having to give up a part of myself to do so. And that's a work by Dr. John Powell, who's out of the Haas Institute in Berkeley. And so for me, the end game is belonging and inclusion, because belonging means that we can all interact with each other and be our whole selves, or as much as we choose to bring, without that system defining what's normal for me to bring into it. And then inclusion is where I actually think about the whole systemic structure. So belonging is personal and inclusion is systemic. Now we have to start to look at the institutional policies and practices and protocols, and both the spoken and unspoken practices that you learn about the spoken ones with your little handbook. And then I learned about the unspoken ones in the organization when I broke the rules. Then I was told that's not acceptable. And so I think there's a lot to think about. And then the other part of it is it was designed as a patriarchy. And even the hierarchical structure of governance was designed to keep those same gentlemen in power at the top. And if you had enough privilege, you got to the top. And if you didn't, you'd always just get the information as it flowed down. And the challenge with that is it gets misinterpreted or reinterpreted at each step. So I think the bigger question is what are we going to do? Like, what are some actions that we can take? And what are some things that, as you go through this day to day, that you'll walk away with and attempt or do or think differently about? Because even the idea of privilege, I'm not white, but I have a lot of privilege. And so how do we have a conversation about privilege without it denigrating into that racial piece? It's because privilege is acted out from all racial perspectives. I've seen people of color who were really privileged, and I've seen myself become part of a political system where I became systematized, and I acted just like all of those politicians that you're seeing. And when I realized it, I had to step out of it. And so it goes back to, we'll never be perfect, and yet lots of opportunities to practice. And so I'd love to maybe see if we can shift, Judith and Yolanda, to what are some things you think people can do when they leave here?
I think that's great. Thank you, Bill. And I actually just put something in the chat. I just saw this yesterday, and it's a little news piece. It's like 8 minutes long about the Kerner Commission. I don't know how many of you know what that was, but it was a commission that was put together over 50 years ago to try to understand the issues of race relations in our country. It was very powerful, really laid out and named systemic racism, and talked about what needed to be done to achieve equity, to really address it. There is an interview with the lone surviving member of the Kerner Commission, who's in his 90s. He was a senator from Oklahoma when he did it. Blew my mind. He really gets it and speaks to it. And then they also talk about what happened politically that moved us away from moving into those solutions. It's very similar to what's happening now. So I just think I was like blown away. I hope you'll watch it. It's only 8 minutes. There's a lot to learn there. And it's, we've made a lot of progress, and yet some ways we haven't moved at all in terms of some of our ideas around race in this country. So it'll be interesting, I think, for people. So that's one of the things that I would say is educate yourself, continue to read, continue to expose yourself to different narratives, do it through who you read, what you read. I highly recommend Cast as well as a book. And you can do it with fiction as well. But, come into a different worldview, have an opportunity to see life as it's experienced by someone who isn't born into your certain circumstance. Yolanda, what are some of your ideas?
One of the things that I actually practice in life is having someone that you love and trust, make that agreement of calling in each other when we see bias in behaviors. In this case, that's my husband. We are very open to normalizing the conversation about bias, because when we have incidents where we're being judgmental or we're categorizing people, labeling people, generalizing people, that when that time comes, that we have that agreement and we normalize conversations, so we are able to actually do it in a way that it's not coming out of the blue, right? It's like we're establishing already an agreement, and we're also establishing a culture or the normalcy of addressing bias. So that's one thing. And that could be, you can find that person like in your workplace, right? Someone that you trust, to be your accountability body, right? The other thing is cultivating curiosity. Whenever you feel that you're being activated or triggered by the behavior of a person, instead of going directly into judgment, ask yourself, I wonder why this person acted like this, right? It's like that I wonder, right? Mm-hmm. It opens that for the room for the mind to be able to cultivate curiosity and kind of not really just dive into judgment. So the I wonder and the finding your accountability body.
Yolanda, there's another connection, because I too have talked about an accountability buddy or an accountability partner from the same lens. Like when you go home and you have somebody that trusts you, that loves you, that cares about you, share the process. So that's another connection that I think is really great. And I have a few in my family, and believe me, they hold me accountable. Like they'll hear me say something, they'll be like, what? Mr. Bias, you just said that? Like, sorry. So they do it in a fun way, and they don't hesitate to do it because I've asked them to do that. And I think if you're looking to create this culture in a workplace or in a community, even having those conversations with people about, so how do we hold each other accountable? Because again, awareness to action, and then the next level is how do we create this structure? And I think, again, we need to have a conversation, because for some people, the word accountability means punitive, or it means that you're going to dump on me, or you're going to tell me how bad I am. So before you jump into that, you need to socialize what we're talking about, because accountability in this work is not about I got you or demeaning or denigrating. It's encouraging and embracing and having dialogue. And so that's why I say language is really important, because people who have been held accountable and lost their jobs are going to have a whole different perspective of that word accountability than somebody who's been held accountable in a way that enabled them to grow. So, and again, there's a story behind each one. And so that's partly what I mean too about being aware of language, not just from a deficit base, also from understanding that there's so many perspectives on the language that we use that we need to take the time to have those conversations, because when we don't, we end up having the conversation on the other end when there's a conflict, and then we have to spend time, as my fellow mediators here know, then you have to spend time de-escalating the conflict. So you're going to either put your energy in over here, building the relationships and socializing what you're doing, or you're going to put your energy in over here when you're going to have a much harder time because people are emotionally charged and conflict kind of permeates the whole culture. And so really spend the time building that strong foundation, however that looks for you or your organization, because with that strong foundation, it'll support those really tough accountability conversations. It will still create conflict. It's just that you will be going through it knowing that it's for my growth versus my detriment or my dehumanization. And for me, the thing that I always say is I want people to leave whole. Whole doesn't mean that you weren't uncomfortable, that you weren't emotionally charged, that you didn't have some feelings. It means that you left and you could say, I went to this really interesting workshop today and I wasn't demonized, denigrated, or dehumanized for who I was or the perspective that I brought. And so we're back now, Judith. We have about 4 minutes left. So I'm just
Yeah,
if there's any questions.
Yeah, do you all have any questions? Because I, of course, have another thought.
Well, you think, and I'll watch the chat. If you want to put it in the chat, you go ahead and talk.
I've been thinking when you were talking about that, Bill, and I really think a lot about, I worked in restorative justice. I appreciate, I have a colleague who calls it transformative justice. I've really been thinking about how that changes things. And one of the things that I think is, are we bridging or breaking? And that's language from John Powell, who looks at othering and belonging. So are my actions, are my thinking, am I bridging toward belonging, or am I breaking toward othering? And I think that's important. And, you know, I think I really appreciate that the Jewish Federation of Portland has created this space and this conversation. And I think about my understanding of the word tikkun is it means to heal the world. It's the work of healing the world. And that's a Hebrew word and a concept that comes out of the Judaic tradition that I feel very drawn to and aligned with. And somebody correct me if I got that all wrong. It's completely possible. But I hope that we do think about our action being that we do have work of healing the world. And it starts with healing ourselves. Yolanda, do you have it? So I guess mostly no questions have popped up.
No.
Yeah, just one final thought about folks, about one of the ways of also diving into addressing the biases is also not knowing our history. And the U.S. Federation of Greater Portland has done a really good job of providing that education. So really understanding like what are the roots of also some of the biases that we might carry, that we might not even be aware that it's actually from our great grandparents or history, the culture that was very explicit at that time, and now that is no longer, but it's still being reinforced in our cultural norms and standards. So just know your history of people who have been dehumanized, and by that I speak about Black, Brown, Indigenous, people with disability, queer, bisexual, right? All of histories of people who are not considered part of that dominant group. And that's it.
So I guess that's it. Bill, I want to thank you again for your plenary this
You're
morning. I
welcome.
want to thank Emmett for your poem. I hope that poem's going to be available so we can reference it, because I would definitely love to read it again. And I'm excited about the Lunchtime Plenary. We have some great speakers that are going to be talking to us then. So go in peace.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you,
Thank
Judith.
you. Thanks, everybody.
yourself.
Have a good day.